Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited here to address your group and be part of this interfaith dinner. Although this is my first visit in over 40 years, I think, to Southern California, I feel very much at home. What year would it have been? It was maybe back in the early 60s. I spent a year at University of California, Riverside. Part of my family, my brother used to live out here and sister-in-law, and so part of my family is still here, so they've come to visit this evening. The other reason why I feel very much at home is I've been to several of these dinners that were organized not by the Pacifica Institute, but by other dialogue institutes that come from much the same inspiration, that are all oriented towards building greater understanding among peoples of various religions, of different cultures, different backgrounds. You know, the people who have been instrumental in getting the Pacifica Institute going, they come from one of the more dynamic movements in Islam today, and I'd like to talk about them a little bit. But before I do that, I want to start with something an experience I had just last month. I was in Indonesia, and we had a group of students from theological students from Berkeley, so right up the coast, and they were taking a course in contextualized theology, and we had an exposure program, and so we were up on the upper slopes of Mount Merapi, which is an active volcano in central Java, and we were trying to see the ecological programs that were going on. Most of the villages there are about 60% Muslim and about 40% Christian. But they're working very well together to on programs for water, use of water, land reclamation, the sand mining, trying to limit that and control it a bit, and so these various programs. So one evening I was sitting there talking to a man. His name was Sadiq. He was the head man of one of the villages, a Muslim, and I said to him, have you had any problems here between Muslims and Christians? Are they getting along all right? And he said, you know, we both believe, Muslims and Christians, in the one God. We both want to do God's will. How can we possibly not be united in trying to serve humanity together? And I thought that this man, he was an uneducated rice farmer, subsistence farmer, high on the mountain, but he really intuited what interfaith dialogue is all about. He was just talking in response to my question about Muslims and Christians, but certainly he could say Jews, certainly he could say people of good faith, of whatever religion. Now, what I want to kind of focus on, though, this evening is the kind of ideas behind the Pacifica Institute and similar organizations. You know, there are these dialogue organizations now. I think there's about 30 or 40 in the States alone, but also in Europe, also in the Balkans they have them now, also in Southeast Asia. I know one or two in Africa, where these people are trying to work to bring about greater understanding, greater respect, greater cooperation among people of various religions. Now, a lot of this comes from the thinking of a particular, very charismatic Turkish teacher named Fethullah Gülen. He comes from Eastern Turkey. He's actually just slightly older than I am myself. He started out as as a teacher of the Quran in eastern Turkey, and then he moved to the very western part of the country, to Izmir, a very cosmopolitan Mediterranean city. And there he got involved in youth work. And so he started with summer camps for young people, and then he had the idea, and I think this was really brilliant, of setting up these lighthouses, he called them. And these were residences for students. And the young people would live together there, and they'd prepare for their university exams. Afterwards, they'd carry on their university training. Now, today, there's over 10,000 of these residences of students, and it really has been an important part of the network. They form friendships, older brother, younger brother relationships that go, older sister, younger sister, that go all through their lives. They carry on their studies in a very good environment that's free from drugs and sex and alcohol and smoking and gambling or whatever. And you get a network of people who are sharing much the same vision. They also get kind of spiritual training in these residences. Well, this was sort of the beginning of the movement. Back in the 80s, really, we see it kind of coming together in cities like Izmir. Well, with the presidency of Turgut Özal in the late 1980s, you got a whole new environment in Turkey growing up. And people could much more freely practice and state their faith. And so the movement got transformed little by little into an emphasis on education and service of society through education. They started setting up these schools, very good schools, and they were growing up in Turkey. And as you remember, in 1989, when the Soviet system fell apart, there was a real need for what kind of post-Soviet education can be constructed in these former communist regions. And they moved in very early on, and they tried to, and they set up schools throughout the Russian Federation, particularly in the places with large numbers of Muslims, but also in the Balkans, also in the Central Asian republics like Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, etc. And I can remember once in Kyrgyzstan, I was going there because we Jesuits were setting up a dialogue center in the capital in Bishkek. And the people who welcomed me from the very beginning, really from the first day, were people from the Gulen community. They have 12 schools in Bishkek, and I remember being invited in to speak to the fourth graders. And so I was talking to the fourth graders about whatever it was, I forget. And I talked for about 15 minutes. And then the teacher stopped me and he said, I'd like to ask the students something now. He said, you've been listening to Mr. Michel here, and I'd like to ask you from his accent and his pronunciation, where would you say he comes from? Ooh, a bunch of the hands go up, and they said, from the United States. He said, that's right. I said, that's right, from the United States. And he said, now tell me some of the words that he was using, or some of the pronunciations that led you to this. Oh, and they were saying, well, this and this and this. And I thought, these were fourth graders in Bishkek, in Kyrgyzstan, of all places. I just mentioned this as an example to show that they really are giving quality education. The number of awards that they win in the Olympiads and that. I want to tell you about another school because I think it comes to the topic that I was given, contribution of interfaith dialogue to building peace. Here we're moving to the very southern tip of of the Philippines, on the island of Mindanao. The city at the very bottom tip is Zamboanga. It's about half Muslim, half Christian. And since the 70s, it's been kind of a dicey place. There's a lot of kidnapping going on, snipers on the roads. The paramilitary has been active, and they've been doing things. The insurgents are active. So when you go out of Zamboanga on the road out of town, up the north coast, west coast, you're kind of nervous as you're looking out the window. You're kind of watching behind the trees to see if anybody's going to pop out. And at one point, the car turns a corner, and you see a big sign. It says, "Welcome to the Filipino-Turkish School of Tolerance." And you go through the gate, and it really is a little island of tolerance. It's Muslim, Christian teachers with over 1,000 boarding students, Muslim, Christian again, living together, doing good education, really preparing people for university, and doing it in an environment of real commitment, of real peace, of real tolerance. I never forget that experience, and every time I go back, I teach in the Philippines every year, and I try always to visit this school, and it's really impressive. Now, I don't want you to think that this is only an educational movement. It's a movement of service. The idea is to serve society, to serve God by serving society. Fethullah Gulen one time said, the idea is to serve God, but since God doesn't need any service, we serve God by serving society. Now, one way to do it is through education, to fight ignorance. Another way to do it is in their development programs, which are very good, especially in Africa. And the third way is through their dialogue programs. I'll give another example. This was, I think, 4 years ago in the town of Haran, near Urfa. We had an Abrahamic understanding, our heritage. And it was really very impressive. Now, you might not have heard of Haran or Urfa. Urfa in eastern Turkey is the city, it's the ancient Edessa, which was an important Christian city in the early centuries. But more importantly, it's called the city of the prophets. It was there that, according to tradition, Abraham was born, Urfa, Ur. So it's one of the candidates, the other candidate being in Iraq, of course. But you can visit the birthplace of Abraham in Urfa. People come there, busloads come every day from Iran and Syria and all parts of Turkey to visit the birthplace of Abraham. There's also Prophet Job or Ayub, who was supposed to have been, according to tradition, from there. Prophet Elisha or Ilyasa. So it was the center of a number of the prophets. Well, they chose this because it was the city of Abraham to really try to bring together Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars to really look at Abraham, to see how Abraham unites us, and to see in what ways we might take a different approach to Abraham. In other words, to grow in understanding of one another on this key person in the faith of us all. So we spent 3 days there. Now, I mentioned Haran. Haran is about 30 miles outside of the modern city of Urfa, and its ruins. It was destroyed in the 13th century by the Mongol armies, and so until today it's just ruins. Well, they set up these tents in the middle of the ruins, and we began with a real Abrahamic understanding. Now this that we've been trying to carry on. I was involved from the early stages in trying to make the contacts with Christian and Jewish groups. In the process, I learned that there's about 20 Abrahamic organizations of Jews, Christians, and Muslims around the world. One of which is here in Los Angeles, and then you have Sweden and France, and Bosnia has one, Australia, etc. Well, what does it mean, really to work together to build peace? I think we have to not just sort of use good words, but we really have to be doing something. One of the things we're trying to do is we have a peace studies and conflict transformation course in Asia. We have students from 16 Asian countries every year, about 45 students, and the idea is to turn out a number of people who can be working in this field, who know the techniques of conflict analysis and conflict transformation, who can work together for rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reconciliation after conflicts. People that we can send as mixed groups, interreligious groups, when tensions are going on, and so this is a way to do it. I did want to conclude just with one final story before we have some time for discussion and that. And this also goes back to the city of Urfa, eastern Turkey. I was teaching there, and one day the Gülen community, they invited me to a dinner, very much like this. It reminds me a lot of our dinner tonight. Just people from different walks of life. And I was sitting next to a man. He had a plumbing supplies company, so he had pipes and wrenches and fittings and that sort of thing. So we were talking about various things, and I mentioned that I spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia. And he said, "Well, have you ever been to Cambodia?" And I said, "Yes. Actually, I was just there last year for an interreligious meeting." He said, quite simply, he said, I have a school in Cambodia. "You do?" And he says, "Yes, in Kampong Cham. And it's one of the schools in this community. And I've been to that school. It's about, maybe 60-70% of the students are Buddhists, and a good number of Muslims as well, and some Christians. It's his project." Well, I never dreamed that I would be meeting the donor who made this school possible in a plumbing contractor in an eastern Anatolian city. I think it's a good sign of the sort of a positive effect, you might say, of globalization. That maybe 50 years, Urfa and Cambodia might as well have been on different planets. But today, through movements like this of people who are committed to working for interfaith understanding, to building peace concretely by working to fight against humanity's three big enemies. This is what Mr. Gülen has said. He said the three big enemies facing us not are other people, but they are ignorance, poverty, and disunity. And so far, they have their education programs to fight ignorance. They have their development programs to fight poverty. They have their dialogue programs to fight disunity. And so I applaud them. I could speak and have spoken in many other occasions of other movements around the world that are really working for building peace, building understanding. But tonight, in honor of our hosts, in honor of our organizers, I did want to say a few words about the Gulen movement, or as they call it simply, the Hizmet, the service of humanity. So thank you very much for your attention.